I've been a truck driver for over a decade. I've hauled loads through every kind of weather, across endless highways, and spent countless nights alone on the road. I don't mind it. In fact, I've always liked the solitude, just me and the long stretch of road. But one October night, something happened that I'll never forget. It started with a call from my boss. He told me I had a special delivery to make, a late-night run to a small town called Black Hollow. The name didn't mean anything to me at the time, just another job, another town on the map. I was to leave at midnight, a bit unusual, but nothing I hadn't done before. I pulled up to the warehouse, loading my truck under the cold, bright light of the full moon. The wind bit at my face as I checked the boxes in the back. They were labeled fragile, but I didn't care what was inside. It was my job to deliver them safely, and that's all that mattered. By the time I got on the highway, the night was completely still. The radio crackled with nothing but static, so I turned it off and drove in silence, the hum of the engine my only company. The road was empty, and as the miles rolled by, I began to feel that familiar sense of isolation, just me, the dark sky, and the long ribbon of road ahead. After a couple of hours, my eyelids grew heavy, and I decided to stop for some coffee. I pulled into a small rest area, one of those places with flickering neon lights and empty parking lots. The place seemed deserted, except for a tired-looking woman standing behind the counter. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air as I walked inside. "Can I get a cup of coffee?" I asked, already feeling the cold seeping through my jacket. She poured me a cup and handed it over without a word. I took a sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. As I stood there, I noticed a wall covered with old newspaper clippings. Something about it caught my eye, and I stepped closer. One of the headlines read, "Truck driver disappears en route to Black Hollow." "Black Hollow, huh?" the woman said, her voice low and tired. "You heading that way?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just a delivery." She gave me a strange look. "You be careful out there. That place. Well, let's just say not everyone makes it back." I chuckled, though her words sent a chill down my spine. "I've been driving for 10 years. I'll be fine." She didn't say anything else, just watched me as I finished my coffee and headed back to my truck. The road was darker now, the fog rolling in thick and heavy, wrapping around the trees like ghostly fingers. I drove on, the highway narrowing as I neared Black Hollow. A strange sense of unease crept over me. Maybe it was the fog, or maybe it was the woman's warning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, I saw the sign, "Welcome to Black Hollow." The town was silent, with only a few dim streetlights casting long shadows on the empty streets. I followed the directions my boss had given me, turning down a narrow road that led to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, surrounded by tall grass and trees that swayed in the wind. I parked the truck and got out, grabbing the clipboard in one of the boxes. The air was colder now, the wind howling through the broken windows of the warehouse. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the cracked concrete floor. The light was dim, and the shadows seemed to move around me as I walked toward the loading dock. There was a low hum in the air, like a machine running in the distance, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. As I walked further into the warehouse, I spotted a figure standing near a pile of old crates. He was dressed in a dirty jacket, his face hidden in the shadows. "You waiting for the delivery?" I asked, holding up the clipboard. He didn't answer at first, just stood there, watching me. Finally, he nodded. "You brought the boxes?" "Yeah," I said, a bit uneasy. "What's in them?" The man smiled, but there was something wrong about it. His teeth were too white, too perfect. "Just some old things. Nothing you need to worry about." I handed him the clipboard to sign, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stepped closer, his breath cold against my face. "You should leave," he whispered. "You don't want to be here after dark." I laughed nervously, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Just doing my job, man. I'll be out of here soon." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I froze, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. When I finally got the light on, the man was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no answer, just the low hum of that unseen machine. I turned to leave, but the door I had entered through was now shut tight. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, shouting for someone to let me out. The wind howled outside, and I swore I could hear whispers in the distance, but no one came. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open on its own. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of the warehouse, not stopping until I was back at my truck. My hands shook as I climbed into the cab, slamming the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Just a weird town, I told myself. Nothing to worry about, but as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I cursed under my breath, trying again. This time the engine roared to life, but as I pulled away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Standing by the side of the road, just at the edge of the fog, was the man from the warehouse. He was watching me, his eyes glowing in the moonlight. My heart raced as I hit the gas, speeding down the narrow road, desperate to get out of Black Hollow. I drove for what felt like hours, the fog growing thicker, the trees pressing in around me. The road seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into the woods. I checked the GPS, but the screen flickered, showing nothing but static. Suddenly, the engine sputtered again, and my headlights flickered. I swerved, trying to keep control of the truck, but it was no use. The engine died, and I was left in complete darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the eerie silence. Then, I heard it, a low whisper, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the fog, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, surrounding the truck. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The footsteps were closer now, and I could feel something watching me, waiting. In a panic, I jumped out of the truck, running toward the trees. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from whatever was out there. The fog closed in around me, and the whispers followed, growing louder with every step. I stumbled through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers turned into chants, strange words I couldn't understand. I pushed through the trees, desperate to escape. Finally, I burst into a clearing, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A group of people stood around a fire, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their voices low and haunting. In the center of the circle was the man from the warehouse, his eyes glowing in the firelight. He turned to me, his smile twisted and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here, Jake." "How do you know my name?" I demanded, fear gripping me. "You were chosen," he said, stepping closer. "We've been waiting for you." I backed away, but the group closed in, their eyes glowing in the dark. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. "You belong to us now," the man said, his voice low and hypnotic. I turned and ran, pushing through the trees, the sound of their chants echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my truck still sitting there, the headlights flickering weakly. I jumped inside, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the road, not daring to look back. Hours later, I finally reached the city. The lights of the buildings felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness. I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but relieved to be home. But as I stepped out of the truck, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my boss. "Where are you? You were supposed to deliver the goods." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd delivered the boxes, hadn't I? Suddenly, the shadows around me seemed to move, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The shadows still watch me, waiting for the night when they'll come back. Because I know one thing for sure, I'll never escape Black Hollow. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years now. The open road is home to me, the place where I feel most at peace. There's something comforting about the steady hum of the engine, the miles rolling by under the tires, and the quiet of the night stretching out ahead. But every driver has their strange stories, things they can't quite explain. I had heard plenty of them from fellow truckers. Ghost towns, eerie hitchhikers, things seen out of the corner of your eye that aren't there when you look again. I never put much stock in them. That is, until a night I'll never forget. It was late October, just before Halloween, and I had been on a long haul through the Midwest. The weather was cold, the sky overcast, and the wind cutting sharp. I had a load of electronics to deliver to a small town I had never heard of before, Harrow's Ridge. It was supposed to be a quick run, in and out. The town was off the beaten path, somewhere between cornfields and forests. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another town. The night I was scheduled to leave, the sky was black, clouds heavy with the threat of rain. I set off around midnight, the roads mostly empty as usual. I kept the radio on low, a mix of static and faint country songs coming in and out as I drove. The road stretched ahead of me, long and lonely, just the way I liked it. But as the miles passed, a feeling of unease began to settle in. About 2 hours into the drive, I started noticing something strange. The headlights of my truck seemed weaker, dimming just enough to make me think I needed to check the bulbs. It wasn't enough to stop, but it made me a little nervous. The road itself had started to change too. It narrowed and became more twisted, like it was leading me deeper into nowhere. I checked my GPS, but it showed the same route. So, I kept driving. Eventually, I came to a small gas station. It was the only light for miles, a tiny, run-down place with a single flickering neon sign that read "Last Stop." My truck was low on fuel, so I pulled in. There was no one around, no other cars, no one behind the counter when I stepped inside. The station had an old, musty smell, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I rang the bell on the counter, and after a long pause, an old man shuffled out from the back. He was hunched over, his clothes dirty and torn, but his eyes were sharp, watching me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Fill her up?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He didn't answer at first, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You heading to Harrow's Ridge?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Yeah, just making a delivery." The old man shook his head. "Ain't a good night for that." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't explain, just handed me the pump and walked back to his chair behind the counter. I filled the tank and went back inside to pay. Before I left, he said one more thing that stuck with me. "If you see any lights off the road, don't stop." I laughed it off, but there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. I got back in the truck, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just an old man trying to spook me, I told myself. Nothing more. I got back on the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and soon enough, the gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror. The uneasy feeling lingered though, and I couldn't shake the words the old man had said. About 30 minutes later, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was a car pulled off to the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. A man was standing next to it, waving for help. I slowed down, instinct kicking in. A stranded driver. It wouldn't be the first time I'd helped someone out on a lonely road like this. But then, I remembered the old man's words. "If you see any lights off the road, don't stop." I hesitated. The guy looked desperate, but there was something about him that seemed off. His face was pale, almost too pale, and his movements were jerky, like he wasn't quite sure how to move. My instincts told me to keep driving. I passed him, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The man wasn't alone. There were others coming out of the woods, their faces blank, their eyes empty. My heart pounded as I hit the gas. speeding down the road. Something wasn't right. I had never seen people move like that, so unnatural, like they weren't entirely human. The road twisted and turned, and the woods grew thicker on either side. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even though I didn't see anyone behind me. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in around the truck. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into my skin. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the road there was another car, this one completely dark. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid it. My truck came to a stop just inches from the abandoned vehicle. I sat there, heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. My headlights illuminated the car, and I could see that the windows were fogged up. There was something written on the glass, smeared in what looked like blood. "Help me." I froze, my mind racing. There was no way I was getting out of the truck, not after what I had just seen. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something, or someone, was crawling out from under the car. It was a woman, her face twisted in fear, her hands clutching at the ground as she dragged herself toward my truck. I could hear her faintly, her voice weak and hoarse. "Help, please." I should have driven away. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. I watched as she struggled to her feet, stumbling toward the passenger side of my truck. She pounded on the door, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, let me in. They're coming," she screamed. I hesitated for only a second before reaching over to unlock the door, but before I could pull the handle, she stopped, her body going rigid. Her head jerked to the side, as if she had heard something I couldn't. Then, slowly, she backed away from the truck, her face going blank. She turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows without another word. I sat there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell had just happened? I didn't wait to find out. I threw the truck into gear and sped off, the wheels screeching against the pavement. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees looming over me like a tunnel of darkness. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see something, anything, chasing after me. But there was nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the lights of Harrow's Ridge up ahead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I drove into town, I realized that something was very wrong. The streets were empty, not a single soul in sight. The houses were dark, their windows shattered, and the street lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The town looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the GPS had said this was my destination. I pulled up to the address I had been given, a small warehouse at the edge of town. The place was run down, the roof caved in, and the doors hanging off their hinges. But the lights inside were still on, flickering dimly. I got out of the truck, my breath visible in the cold air. As I approached the door, I noticed something scrawled across it in large red letters. "Turn back." I didn't need to be told twice. I spun around and ran back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the driver's side door, I froze. Standing in front of the truck was the woman from earlier, her face pale and blank. She stared at me, her eyes empty, and behind her, I saw the figures from the woods, their dark forms emerging from the shadows. They were coming for me. I jumped into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. The figures were getting closer, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck sped forward, the figures disappearing into the darkness behind me. I drove all night, not stopping until I was miles away from Harrow's Ridge. When I finally pulled over at a rest stop, my hands were still shaking, and my mind was racing. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't care to ever find out. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go near that town again. Something evil lurks in Harrow's Ridge, and whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting for the next driver foolish enough to make the trip. My name is Tom, and I've been a trucker for over 12 years. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but none of them ever scared me. Trucking is my life. I like the long hours, the quiet highways, and being alone with my thoughts. That was true until one night in late October. That night changed everything. It was just after midnight when I got the call. My boss, Joe, asked if I could make an urgent delivery to a small town about 4 hours away. I wasn't planning on another run that night, but Joe promised me extra pay, so I agreed. I've never been the kind to turn down money, especially when it's an easy delivery. It was just after midnight when I got the call. My boss, Joe, asked if I could make an urgent delivery to a small town about 4 hours away. I wasn't planning on another run that night, but Joe promised me extra pay, so I agreed. I've never been the kind to turn down money, especially when it's an easy delivery. It was just after midnight when I got the call. My boss, Joe, asked if I could make an urgent delivery to a small town about 4 hours away. I wasn't planning on another run that night, but Joe promised me extra pay, so I agreed. I've never been the kind to turn down money, especially when it's an easy delivery. It was just after midnight when I got the call. It was just after midnight when I got the call. My boss, Joe, asked if I could make an urgent delivery to a small town about 4 hours away. I wasn't planning on another run that night, but Joe promised me extra pay, so I agreed. I've never been the kind to turn down money, especially when it's an easy delivery. It was just after midnight when I got the call. My boss, Joe, asked if I could make an urgent delivery to a small town about 4 hours away. I wasn't planning on another run that night, but Joe promised me extra pay, so I agreed. I've never been the kind to turn down money, especially when it's an easy delivery. About 30 minutes later, I noticed something odd. The road ahead was covered in fog, thick and heavy. It was like driving into a cloud. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly as my visibility dropped to almost nothing. The fog seemed unnatural, like it wasn't just weather, but something more. Suddenly, my truck shuddered. I thought I had hit something, but there was nothing in the road. I pulled over to the side, turned on my hazards, and got out to check. The cold night air hit me as I stepped down from the cab. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around the truck, inspecting the tires and undercarriage. Everything seemed fine, but as I walked around to the back of the truck, I noticed something strange. There were deep scratches along the side of the trailer, long and jagged, like something had clawed at it. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anything, but those scratches were fresh. I stared at them, trying to figure out what could have caused them. An animal? No, they were too high up, too clean. Feeling uneasy, I got back into the truck and locked the doors. The fog was still thick, but I needed to keep moving. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something in the darkness. The fog seemed to get thicker as I drove, and soon I couldn't see anything beyond the headlights. The trees, the road, everything was swallowed by the mist. My heart was racing, and I had to force myself to focus on the road ahead. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall and still, its face hidden by the fog. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a stop just feet from it. My hands were shaking as I stared through the windshield, trying to make out what it was. It didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I honked the horn, hoping it would move, but it didn't react. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a person, or what looked like a person, standing in the road. I didn't want to get out of the truck again, not with that thing standing there, but I couldn't just sit there forever. After what felt like hours, I finally decided to drive around it. Slowly, I steered the truck to the side, keeping my eyes on the figure the whole time. As I passed it, I got a closer look. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Its skin was pale, almost white, and its eyes were glowing, two bright, unnatural lights staring right at me. I hit the gas, speeding away as fast as I could. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see it following me, but the fog was too thick to see anything. For the next hour, I drove in silence, my mind racing. What had I seen? What was that thing? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the fog and the darkness, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The road ahead started to clear, the fog lifting as I got closer to the town. My GPS told me I was only a few miles away. I let out a shaky breath, relieved to be getting closer to civilization. But then, just as I thought I was in the clear, the truck shuddered again. This time, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I cursed under my breath, turning the key, but the truck wouldn't start. I was stuck. I sat there for a moment, trying to think. Should I wait for help, call someone? But my phone had no signal. and there hadn't been another car on the road for hours. I was alone. Reluctantly, I got out of the truck again, flashlight in hand. I opened the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. Everything looked fine, but the truck wouldn't start. Then, I heard it. A noise in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods. My heart raced as I turned, shining the flashlight into the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness and shadows. But then, I saw movement. Something was coming toward me, something tall and thin, moving slowly but steadily. It was the figure from the road. Panic surged through me, and I bolted back to the truck. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing hard, my hands shaking. The figure was closer now, walking out of the woods and into the light of my flashlight. It stopped just a few feet from the truck, its glowing eyes staring at me through the windshield. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent, like it wasn't entirely real. Its body was thin and twisted, and its face, it had no mouth. Just those eyes, watching me. I tried the ignition again, praying the truck would start. Nothing. The figure moved closer, its hand reaching out toward the truck. I felt trapped, helpless. There was no way out. The air in the cab felt colder, like the temperature had dropped suddenly. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost started to form on the inside of the windows. Just as the figure's hand touched the door, the truck roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, the tires screeching on the pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop again until I reached the town. When I pulled into the delivery point, my hands were still shaking, and I could barely speak. The guy at the warehouse asked if I was okay, but I didn't tell him what had happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? I finished the delivery as quickly as I could and got out of there. On the way back, I took a different route. I didn't care if it added time to the drive. I wasn't going anywhere near that road again. It's been a week since that night, but I still can't stop thinking about it. That thing, whatever it was, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I'm on the road late at night, I can feel it watching me, waiting for me to come back. But I never will. Being a truck driver sounds like an adventure to most people, driving through different towns, seeing the country, making your own hours. But there's a darker side to it that most people don't know. I learned that the hard way one October night when I took a delivery through a road I'll never forget. My name is Rick, and I've been driving trucks for over 15 years. I'm used to long nights, quiet highways, and the loneliness that comes with the job. Most days I don't mind it. But this trip was different. It was late October, and the weather had already turned cold. The leaves had fallen from the trees, leaving bare branches that twisted in the wind. I had just finished a long haul from Texas to Montana, and I was ready to head back home to Ohio for a few days of rest. But then I got a call from my dispatcher, Jerry. "Rick, I got a last-minute job for you," Jerry said in his usual gruff voice. "It's a bit out of the way, but it pays well. A delivery to a place called Briar Ridge." "Never heard of it," I replied, glancing at my map on the dashboard. "Yeah, it's a small town. Real small. Up in northern Wisconsin, but the company's offering double pay for a late-night delivery. You interested?" Double pay was tempting, and I wasn't one to turn down extra cash. Plus, I didn't have any big plans waiting for me at home. "All right, I'll take it. Send me the details." Jerry emailed me the address, and I punched it into my GPS. Briar Ridge wasn't even listed on the map, but the coordinates were there. It looked like it was deep in the woods, far off the main highways. I shrugged it off. There were plenty of small towns like that, tucked away where no one bothered to go. I figured it was just another backwoods delivery. I loaded up my truck with the cargo, a shipment of what looked like construction supplies, and set off just after 9 p.m. I figured I could make it to Briar Ridge by dawn if I didn't take any long breaks. The route took me through some winding country roads, but nothing I hadn't seen before. At first, it was just the usual, open fields, distant farms, and the occasional deer crossing the road. But as I got deeper into Wisconsin, things started to get strange. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig. The trees pressed in on both sides, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows in my headlights. The GPS kept telling me to keep going, but I hadn't seen a house, a car, or even a sign of life for miles. The air felt heavier, colder, like the darkness was wrapping around me. Around midnight, the fog started to roll in. It was thick, hanging low over the road, and my headlights could barely cut through it. I had to slow down to a crawl just to see where I was going. The GPS kept glitching too, flickering on and off, like it wasn't sure where I was anymore. I was beginning to regret taking this job. Then, out of nowhere, the road opened up, and I saw something up ahead, a gas station, its neon sign glowing dimly through the fog. It looked old, run down, like it hadn't been used in years. But I figured I should stop and top off the tank, just in case. I didn't know how much further Briar Ridge was, and I didn't want to get stranded out here. I pulled into the station, the gravel crunching under the tires as I stopped at the pump. The place was deserted. There were no other cars, no lights inside, just the flickering sign that read, Briar Ridge Fuel, last stop for 50 miles. The windows were grimy, and the paint on the building was peeling. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I got out of the truck and started fueling up, shivering as the cold wind cut through my jacket. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the faint creak of the sign swinging in the wind. I glanced around, feeling like I was being watched, but there was no one there. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from behind the station. I froze, my hand gripping the fuel pump. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the gravel. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing, no one. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. I finished fueling up as quickly as I could and climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. I just wanted to get back on the road and out of there. As I pulled out of the station, the fog grew even thicker, almost like it was swallowing up the road. My GPS flickered again, and then it went completely blank. Great, I thought. Now I was on my own. I had no choice but to keep following the road and hope it led to Briar Ridge. The deeper I drove into the woods, the more unsettling it became. The trees loomed over the road, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The fog was so thick that I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but there was nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a sign up ahead, barely visible through the fog. It read, "Welcome to Briar Ridge, population 56. I had made it. Or at least, I thought I had. The town was dark, not a single light on in any of the houses. The buildings were old and dilapidated, their windows broken and boarded up. The streets were empty, not even a stray dog or a wandering cat. It looked like a ghost town, like no one had lived there in years. I followed the GPS coordinates to the delivery site, which was a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building looked just as run down as the rest of the town, but the lights inside were on, flickering weakly. I pulled up to the loading dock and parked the truck. I hesitated for a moment before getting out. Something about the place didn't feel right. The silence was deafening, and the air was so cold that it stung my skin. But I had a job to do, so I grabbed my clipboard and went to check the delivery. As I approached the warehouse door, I noticed something strange. The ground around the loading dock was covered in footprints, large, heavy footprints that led to and from the warehouse. They didn't look like normal shoe prints. They were too big, too deep, almost like they were made by something with claws. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some heavy equipment that had been moved around. I knocked on the warehouse door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. The lights inside flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I decided to just leave the cargo in the loading bay and get out of there as fast as I could. I unlocked the back of the truck and started unloading the boxes, the cold air biting at my fingers. The silence was oppressive, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, a low growl coming from behind the warehouse. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl was deep, guttural, like something big and angry. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight toward the sound. In the darkness, I saw a pair of glowing eyes, yellow, staring right at me. The creature stepped into the light, and my blood ran cold. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with long, matted fur and claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. Its mouth was twisted into a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I dropped the box I was holding and bolted for the truck. My hands fumbled with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. The growling grew louder, closer. I could hear the heavy footsteps behind me, the sound of claws scraping against the pavement. Finally, I managed to get the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The creature lunged at the truck, its claws raking across the metal with a screech. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I peeled out of the loading dock. The fog swallowed the road as I sped through the town, my heart racing. I could see the creature in my mirrors, its glowing eyes still following me, but it didn't chase me onto the road. It just stood there at the edge of town, watching as I disappeared into the night. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I don't know what that thing was, but I'll never forget those eyes, yellow, glowing, full of rage. When I got back to the dispatch office the next morning, Jerry was waiting for me. He looked surprised to see me. "Rick, you actually made it to Briar Ridge?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Yeah, I did," I replied, my voice shaky. "But I'm never going back there." Jerry gave me a strange look and shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone, Rick. That town's been abandoned for years." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What do you mean, abandoned?" Jerry sighed and leaned back in his chair. "There's something wrong with Briar Ridge. People stopped going there a long time ago. Some say it's haunted. Others say there's something living in those woods. Whatever it is, you're lucky you made it out alive." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked out of the office, my mind racing. I knew what I had seen that night wasn't normal. There was something in Briar Ridge, something dark and dangerous, and I had no intention of ever going back. I've been a trucker for over 20 years. I've driven through every state, every kind of weather, and I've seen some pretty strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the Devil's Road. It all started on a chilly October evening. I was hauling a load from Kansas City to Denver, a trip I'd made dozens of times before. The route was straightforward. Interstate highways, a few small towns along the way, and hours of empty roads stretching out in front of me. I was used to these long hauls, the hum of the engine, and the endless miles of asphalt. But this time, things didn't go as planned. My name's Jack, by the way. I'm 45, and I've been trucking since I was 25. It's a lonely job, but it's a life I've come to love. There's a certain freedom in being out on the open road, away from the hustle of everyday life. But that freedom can also come with dangers, things you can't explain, things that don't make sense. It was getting dark, the sky a deep shade of purple as the sun set behind the mountains. I was making good time, with about 5 hours left until I hit Denver. That's when I saw the sign. "Detour ahead, road closed." I cursed under my breath. A detour this late in the trip was the last thing I needed. I checked the GPS, but it wasn't giving me any good alternatives. The only option was a road I'd never heard of before, Route 66A. I knew Route 66, the famous highway, but this was something else. The GPS didn't even show the road in detail, just a long, twisting line through the mountains. I hesitated for a moment, but I had a deadline to meet, and I couldn't afford to waste time. The road looked like it would take me around the closed section and eventually reconnect with the main highway. Figuring it couldn't be too bad, I took the turn. At first, Route 66A seemed like any other back road, narrow, winding, and surrounded by thick trees. The headlights of my rig barely pierced the darkness, and the road was empty, not a single car in sight. The trees grew taller as I drove, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out what little light was left from the setting sun. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. An hour passed, and the road showed no sign of ending. It was strange, according to the GPS. I should have been back on the main highway by now. But the map on the screen was glitching, the line twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The further I drove, the more I felt like something was off, like I shouldn't be here. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but all I got was static. not even a hint of a station. That's when I noticed the fog. It rolled in fast, thick and white, swallowing the road in front of me. The headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to a crawl just to stay on the road. The fog clung to the truck, swirling around like smoke, and I could barely see the trees anymore. It was like the world outside had disappeared, leaving me alone in this thick, suffocating mist. That's when I saw the first sign. It was old, wooden, and barely legible, but I could just make out the words, "Welcome to Black Hollow." I'd never heard of Black Hollow before, and it wasn't on my map, but the sign didn't give me any other options. I kept driving, hoping the town might have a gas station or at least a diner where I could get my bearings. As I drove further into the fog, the road grew narrower, almost like it was closing in on me. Then I saw the lights, dim, flickering, like the glow of an old street lamp. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a street lamp at all. It was a gas station, or at least what was left of one. The building was small, run down, with broken windows and a rusty old sign that read, "Black Hollow Gas." There was no other sign of life, no cars, no people, just the dim light flickering above the pump. I pulled in, more out of desperation than anything else. The fuel gauge was fine, but I needed to stretch my legs, clear my head. I stepped out of the truck and felt the cold air hit me like a punch. It was freezing, much colder than it had been earlier in the night. The fog swirled around my feet as I walked toward the gas station. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, it was dark. Dust covered the shelves, and the air was stale, like no one had been there in a long time. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the emptiness or the dust or the cold. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, hollow and empty. I turned to leave when I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the back of the store. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear it, but the whispering stopped. I told myself it was just the wind, just the cold playing tricks on me. I walked back to the truck, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The fog was thicker now, wrapping around the truck like a blanket. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But the truck wouldn't move. I checked the gear shift, the brakes, everything. It was all fine, but the truck was stuck, like something was holding it in place. I revved the engine, but the wheels wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in. I glanced in the mirrors, but all I could see was fog. Then, I saw them. Figures, moving in the fog, just barely visible. They were tall, thin, and they moved slowly, deliberately, like they were walking through water. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more, but I couldn't make out their faces. They were just shapes, shadows in the mist. I honked the horn, hoping to scare them off, but they didn't stop. They kept moving toward the truck, slow and steady. My heart raced as I slammed the gas pedal, trying to force the truck to move, but it was no use. The figures were getting closer now, almost at the driver's side door. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and shined it into the fog. The light cut through the mist, but it didn't reveal much, just more shadows, more shapes. They were everywhere, surrounding the truck. That's when I saw her. A woman, standing just a few feet from the driver's side window. She was pale, her skin almost translucent in the fog. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her mouth was twisted into a grin that sent a chill down my spine. I screamed, throwing the truck into reverse, but the truck still wouldn't move. The woman stepped closer, her hand reaching for the door handle. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I watched her. She was so close now, I could see the frost forming on the window from her breath. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The figures disappeared into the fog, the woman vanished, and the truck lurched forward as if whatever had been holding it in place had let go. I floored the gas, speeding down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog began to thin as I drove, and the road started to widen again. The GPS came back to life, the map reappearing on the screen as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had, something I couldn't explain. I didn't stop driving until I was well past Black Hollow. I didn't even look back. But by the time I reached Denver, the sun was starting to rise, casting a warm glow over the mountains. I pulled into the drop-off point and parked the truck, my hands still shaking from the night before. I hadn't seen another car, another person, nothing. Just the fog and the figures. I asked around about Black Hollow when I got back, but no one had heard of it. It wasn't on any map, and even my dispatcher had no record of it. It was like the place didn't exist. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt. To this day I can't explain it, but I've never taken a detour again. Sometimes the shortest route isn't always the best one. Sometimes you end up on roads that were never meant to be traveled, and sometimes you don't make it back.